The finance minister has one number he can't say out loud. Last year, every barrel of Soviet oil sold abroad brought in over $30. This morning, the telex from Geneva says the price has slipped below 10. On paper, nothing has changed. The Red Army still stands in Eastern Europe. The state still promises cheap bread, free housing, guaranteed jobs. The party still says the plan is unbreakable. But in this room, the math says something else. For a decade, expensive oil disguised a stagnant economy. It paid for grain the USSR couldn't grow, machines it couldn't build, and allies it couldn't really afford. Now, with oil at $10, the mask is gone. Every month, the Soviet Union is losing the equivalent of tens of billions of dollars a year, and a nuclear superpower has quietly become what it never admitted to being, a petrostate that can't survive cheap oil. How do you kill an empire without firing a shot? You don't bomb its cities, you bankrupt its wells. This is Price and Power, where we uncover the cost of history. The economic weapon in this story isn't a missile or a sanction, it's a price tag. The Soviet Union ran on oil the way a hospital runs on electricity. You can have the best surgeons, the most modern machines. If the power goes out, it all stops. Inside the USSR, prices were fake. The state decided what bread, steel, rent, and wages should cost. But outside, in the capitalist world, it claimed to reject. One price it couldn't control decided everything: oil. In the 1970s, to Middle East wars and an oil embargo sent global prices from under $3 a barrel to over $30. For the US and Europe, it was a shock. For Moscow, it was a golden flood. By the early 1980s, more than half of the USSR's hard currency earnings, money it could actually use to buy grain, technology, and Western goods, came from exporting oil and gas. Think of it like this. A family lives in a crumbling house. The father's factory job barely covers the basics. Then he discovers a lottery ticket that pays him a bonus every month, as long as the numbers stay high. Instead of fixing the house, he builds new rooms, takes on more dependents, promises everyone gifts. It feels generous, it feels permanent. No one asks what happens if the numbers change. The USSR used its oil windfall to freeze a failing system in place. It imported food instead of reforming farms. It bought Western machines instead of fixing its own factories. It propped up allies in Eastern Europe and Cuba with discounted fuel. The curiosity gap is this: how did a state that could plan 5-year cycles down to the nail end up totally unprepared for a price move everyone knew was possible? The answer lies in a bet made in the 1970s and a decision Riyadh made in the 1980s. During the first oil shock in 1973, Soviet planners couldn't believe their luck. Overnight, the West was paying 10 times more for the same barrel of crude. The USSR hadn't become more efficient. Its wells weren't deeper, its pipelines weren't smarter. But the outside world was suddenly willing to pay a cartel premium for what Moscow pumped. Leonid Brezhnov's government took the hint. They poured resources into Western-facing pipelines. They cut back on consumer austerity, not because the socialist factory had started working, but because oil exports made it look like it had. Cheap apartments, subsidized food, a larger, more modern army, and always the promise of catching up with the West. On paper, the USSR was a diversified, planned economy. In practice, more and more of its survival depended on a single volatile line on a Western price chart. During the Iran-Iraq War in the early 1980s, oil stayed high. Washington and Moscow both spent heavily, one on Star Wars, the other on Afghanistan, and keeping up. In the Kremlin, high oil felt like confirmation. Socialism could afford an arms race. It could afford subsidies to Poland when solidarity stirred unrest. It could afford to be both empire and welfare state. But somewhere else, patience was breaking. Saudi Arabia, the swing producer in OPEC, was tired. Tired of cutting its own output to defend a high price. Tired of watching other OPEC members cheat, producing more and cashing in. Tired of high prices feeding new non-OPEC competition in the North Sea, in Alaska, and yes, in the Soviet Union. In 1985, the Saudis changed strategy. They opened the taps. Within months, the world was swimming in crude. For consumers, it was a relief. For oil companies, it was a crisis. For the Soviet Union, it was an unplanned amputation. We are decoding the economic engines of empires every week. If you want to understand the system rather than just watch it, Subscribe to Price and Amp Power Now. Let's get back to why the USSR couldn't survive $10 oil. When oil slipped toward $10, it didn't make front-page news in Pravda, but it rewrote the Soviet budget overnight. At $30 a barrel, 1 million barrels a day brings in roughly $30 million. At $10, that's 10 million. The USSR was exporting several million barrels a day. The loss in hard currency earnings ran into tens of millions every single day. Unlike Western oil states, Moscow couldn't borrow freely on global markets. Its domestic ruble was not convertible. It couldn't devalue, couldn't print dollars, so the planners had three options, none of them good: cut imports of food and consumer goods and risk unrest, cut investment in the oil sector and risk future production, cut military and foreign aid and risk the empire. They tried to do all three at once, slowly. Behind the scenes, the Soviet Union slashed grain imports. Shelves, once merely understocked, went bare in provincial cities. Investment in new oil fields dropped, even as old wells declined. To keep Eastern Europe in line, Moscow had been shipping them oil and gas at below-market prices, then letting them re-export or use it to run their own industries. Now, those subsidies became too expensive. The Kremlin began insisting on world prices and more payment in hard currency from its own satellites. Suddenly, East Germany, Poland, Hungary were squeezed from both ends. Western creditors on one side, a cash-hungry Moscow on the other. What had looked like an unshakable block started to creak. And at the center of it all, a new leader tried to rewrite the rules while the floor was giving way. Mikhail Gorbachev didn't launch perestroika and glasnost from a position of strength. He was running out of money. Cheap oil forced his hand. He couldn't maintain Soviet living standards, the arms race, and the empire. Not on $10 crude, so he cut deals. With Reagan, to limit nuclear weapons. With the West, to borrow and buy time. At home, he tried to decentralize, to make factories care about profit, to allow limited private activity. But those reforms destabilized the system held together by fear and subsidies. Just as the money vanished, so did the glue. From the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, Soviet oil export revenues fell by an estimated third in real terms. The budget deficit ballooned to levels unheard of in the planned economy. By 1989, the USSR was quietly begging for Western grain again. At the same time, Eastern Europe was slipping away. Without cheap Soviet energy, their command economies seized up. Workers revolted. Regimes toppled, first in Poland, then East Germany, then across the bloc. Moscow faced an impossible choice: send in tanks and reassert control at enormous financial and political cost, or let the satellites go and watch the empire shrink. It chose to let go. By 1991, even the Union itself was cracking. The oil-rich republics, like Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, knew where the real value was. Why ship your resources to a central budget that could no longer pay its bills when you could sell them directly to the world? As global prices recovered in the late 80s, the irony was brutal. Oil could have saved a lean, reformed Soviet state, but the crash at $10 had already shattered the old one. In the end, the USSR didn't fall only because of oil. It fell because it built a political system that needed permanently high oil prices to look competent. When those prices vanished, so did the illusion. It's easy to treat the Soviet collapse as a Cold War fairy tale. Communism versus capitalism, freedom versus repression. But if you strip away the slogans, what you see is something much simpler and much more familiar. A state budget hitched to a single volatile commodity. Price leaders making permanent promises with temporary windfalls, a population told the good times were normal, right up until the moment they weren't. Today, dozens of countries run on oil and gas revenues: Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela, and more. They build megaprojects, fund welfare, buy weapons, and project power when prices are high. When prices crash, they raid reserves, borrow, devalue, or they crack. The story of the USSR and $10 oil is not just about the past. It's a warning about what happens when your national strategy assumes that the market will always cooperate. Most people scroll past history. If you stayed, it means you're trying to understand the system, not just react to it. price, and amp power on Substack is where I map these patterns in full. The documents, the timelines, the quiet details that shape empires. If this thinking resonates, join us there. The link is in the description and pinned comment. See you there.